Hopefully everyone has had a chance to review the meetings minutes from our previous meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve the prior meeting's minutes. All right, any discussion on the approval of the prior meeting's minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. The motion carries and the minutes are approved. Next. Okay. We have a little bit of testimony today from a special guest. I would ask my guest and his support person to take the testifiers table. We're pausing to fix some audio issues.
Hey, Kim, can you hear me? Okay, so our Zoom members.
We just can't get this figured out.
Hey, Yuki, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, our remote members have messaged me that they cannot.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Coleman. We have one member.
And here.
I can hear now as well.
Fantastic, thank you.
Hey, we're back online. All right. We have a special guest here today to talk a little bit about his experience with seclusion. I'd like to introduce to you my son, Cullen Seeberger, and next to him is my husband, Mike Seeberger. Cullen, we've talked about this. And I've told some stories to this working group about our family's experience with seclusion. You had that was part of your academic repertoire. Can you talk a little bit about it, what it was like on those days that you found yourself in the seclusion room?
I mean, usually I'd be having an emotional outburst for some reason or another. And usually that would end up with me being put in the seclusion room, which was a very effective way of getting me to calm down, as I didn't have any more like stimulation from anyone else. And I was able to kind of just be with myself and realize that there's no reason to be that upset, or that there's not really a benefit to being that upset. So I'd calm down, and I'd like feel bad that I was that upset and lashed out that much, but it worked for me.
What were the rooms like that you were in?
They were like there's like a white room with kind of like like hard brick walls, but had like a soft paint on them, so they were smooth. And the doors were like magnetically sealed with a window open that someone had to constantly like be at and check in on me to make sure that I was being safe, and to make sure that nothing was going on.
Were you ever unsafe?
I mean, while I was in the room, like oftentimes I'd try and like push the door open, which never worked. They were magnetically sealed and I was a child. And like I'd try and like outsmart them by being like, ooh, I can still like scratch my hands and like generally be a nuisance. which like if I was just like self-harming like that, eventually they would have to intervene. But otherwise, no, I was just like fine.
How did it feel instead of being in the seclusion room when staff had to hold you down?
Um, Scary, uh, panicky. It felt like I still could. When I was upset, it felt like I was proving a point, or like that I was able to get why I felt so bad across in like not a good way. I was just trying to make everyone feel worse. And while like they were holding me, I felt like I still had a chance to make them feel worse because they were interacting with me.
Did holding you down ever help you calm down and re-regulate?
No, it puts you. I mean, yeah, it's kind of just like fight or flight. It's very panic inducing. This summer I actually had a rough time, and I ended up getting like pinned down by some officers, and I can say that didn't help me calm down. That made things way worse. Hell, I still get like bad memories by that. Can't wear the shirt I was wearing then because that makes me feel, oof, yeah.
As you know, I've talked about this work group at home, and there are some, well, in 2023, the legislature banned seclusion for up through grade 3, and there is a directive and some folks who want to ban it universally. What are your thoughts on that?
When you say like universally, do you mean like universal ban through all grades?
Through all grades and in all settings?
Nah, that's a bad idea. Um, if I didn't have like seclusion when I was in school, uh, wouldn't be here. Least as I am now, I'd say chances are like there'd be a much higher chance that I'd either be in like jail or like dead. But like, uh, I don't think banning seclusion's a good idea. It's very useful. Um, when it's a good tool to have, and it's very useful when it is applicable, as it was for me.
Would you feel comfortable taking questions from anybody in the work group? Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Ms. Strauss?
Yes, thank you. So do you know what level you were in, what setting?
I don't know what every school was, but I know I was in 4 for a long time.
Okay.
And eventually, I think during my like last year of middle school, I transitioned to a setting 2, I think. But for majority of my schooling, I was in special ed schools that used seclusion rooms.
And did you have seclusion in the setting too,
Um,
remember?
After like middle school, didn't use seclusion because at that point I was mainly the only like special ed resources I think I was using were like IEPs, like breaks and accommodations. There weren't seclusions at that point.
Thank you.
I can clarify. He was gen ed in kindergarten, setting 3 in grades 1, 2, and 3, setting 4 in grades 4 through 9, and then began transitioning from Cora back to Stillwater High School, and then managed to graduate as a senior in a setting 2. Ms. Woodward?
Well, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. I'm curious, just if you look back, if there was 1 or 2 things that you could share with educators who are working with students who had emotional outbursts and behaviors like you did that sometimes result in seclusion, if there are 1 or 2 things that you would want to tell them or share with them that was most helpful to you in supporting you in those situations, what felt the best or maybe what felt the worst, what would you say?
Um, it's been a while. I don't know what I would say helped me the best or the worst. If I could like say anything to them, I guess it would be thanks. They did help a lot. And I do appreciate what they do. Um, sadly, I can't give the input of like what would help the most or what wasn't super helpful, as it's been like, I think like upwards of like 5 years. So yeah.
That's okay. That's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for indulging me. You're excused.
Yay.
All right, next on the agenda, is this in our packets? In their packets is MDE student support personnel data. There's information. It's the most recent, but it is over a year old and does not reflect the current use of these funds, which will not capture the changes made during 2025, during the 2025 legislative session that introduced new uses for the funds. There will be more up-to-date data available in January. Megan Ariola, MDE Legislative Policy Manager, is, I think, present here to answer questions as needed if anyone here on the work group has questions regarding the student support personnel aid funding. All right, we'll put a pin in that if that comes up during our discussions. We have a resource here available to answer any questions. Next on our agenda, I am going to ask Mr. George to walk through the draft report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, in your packets, you'll find a draft report to the legislature from the Seclusion Working Group. I'm going to walk through this just so later in January, you'll have had a chance to see it before we start discussing it more in depth. Let's see. Third page is the enabling legislation. Sixth page just denotes the membership. The seventh page is where the body of the report starts, gives an overview of the meetings and testimony, starting with the charges of the working group, a summary of the issue. On page 8, we start with the overview of the meetings and the testimony presentations that the working group received. We started with an overview of the restrictive procedure statute, section 125A. That's page 8 and page 9 and page 10. Starting page 10 is where we started receiving data and trends on seclusion and physical holding and other restrictive procedures. Page 11 includes some presentations and testimony of what seclusion looks like in practice from schools and staff. Page 14 is a section on misuse of seclusion and the working group's a review of that data and testimony that the working group received. Page 16 begins the section on alternatives to seclusion, primarily UKERU. Page 18 is the section on student supports, primarily school-based mental health services, a review of presentations from DHS and Hennepin County. And page 20, the end is a placeholder. TBD will be inserting the process and finalized recommendations that the working group adopts later this month in January. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I think we'll accept feedback on this between now and the next meeting in January as well. But I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have now.
Any questions or comments from Mr. George on the draft report? I will say, in reading through the draft report, I was impressed by Mr. George's ability to get a handle on this topic between the time we started meeting and now. And it seems like he was able to grasp a lot of the nuances and issues that we went through as a working group in putting this together. So thank you, Mr. George, for your hard work. I know when we first met at our first meeting to talk about this, I know this was not a topic you were necessarily an expert on, but I appreciate your hard work in putting this draft report together. Again, we'll keep talking about this draft report. If there's anything that folks have questions about, disagree with, would like to see added, we want to discuss, we can certainly do that as we move through this meeting and the next meeting. Should we move on to recommendations? All right, Mr. George.
Members, additionally in your packets, you'll have a table titled compiled recommendations. I'll just do a brief walkthrough of this as well. Members, this is essentially what I've done here is taken the recommendations that were introduced at last week's meetings, categorized them into 4 categories where we noted there was alignment and some degree of overlap in agreement among members. And those categories are mandatory staff training, staff supports, and culture shift. That's on page 1. Apologies, I did not number this table, but that's on page 1. Page 4 begins a table on data collection, monitoring, and accountability. Page 5 is an alternatives to seclusion. Page 6 is funding. So what I've done here is just taken recommendations that were introduced in these from members and put them into these 4 categories from the individual authors of those recommendations. The final table is on use of seclusion timeline. This is, I think, from discussion last meeting where there is not alignment. So what we've done here is just taken, and I have titled that use of seclusion timeline. So this final table here is where there is not alignment. So this is, I think both of these sections, those first 4 tables and this final table here can be used to help the working group begin to work towards finalizing its recommendations. I'm happy to answer any other questions on this.
All right. I think what I'd like to do is discuss the recommendations, see if we're ready to vote on anything here today, if we need more time. I do envision by the end of our next meeting, we will have our recommendations in place, with the final meeting being used to basically adopt the report and send it on its way. So we have today and our next meeting to kind of dig in on this and see where we want to come up. So as Mr. George said, the recommendations that were submitted sort of naturally sorted themselves into 4 categories. The training and staff supports piece, the data collection piece, alternatives piece, and funding piece. I think I think we've talked around a whole bunch of issues, and I've sort of sat here thinking, what about the Zucchero? Like, do we do it like the READ Act? And that's been kind of nagging at me, and I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's something we should address at some point, if that's something we as a state want to get behind and make a recommendation to the legislature. Short of that, I do think training, staff supports, culture shift, all of that are necessary and appropriate and certainly needed in a lot of districts. The data reporting piece, I think we've all identified holes in what we're able to look at in terms of data, things being reported out. And there were some really good ideas during the last meeting about some additional data and ways to collect data, alternatives, and then of course funding. You know, I think when it comes to funding, what I would like to do as a group is submit a recommendation to the legislature of what we want. not taking into consideration whatever budgetary constraints there might be. Let's assume that the money will be there, and ask for what we want. It'll be my problem later on down the road, to figure out how, when, if money gets there. But I think as a working group, we should be prepared to ask for what is necessary in our eyes, funding-wise, to make the improvements that we've identified that are needed. So with that in mind, I'll open it up for discussion. Ms. Heiser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try for the people online to talk directly into my microphone, as silly as that makes it look. I was reviewing the member recommendations, and this might also be for Mr. George with the drafting of the report, but Greta, not to put you on the spot, but I thought that the beginning of Greta's recommendations, where she kind of summarized what the working group agrees on and acknowledges together, and what the working group doesn't agree on or points of contention, would be a really helpful place to start. Not only to potentially include in the report, because I think it's a great summary, but also when we're thinking about what recommendations we do want to move forward on, and with whatever procedure we're going to do with those. It seems like there are significant areas of agreement, and there are significant areas of recommendations that the group can reach a consensus on. So I would suggest that adopting Greta's summary into the report would be appropriate, and then starting our conversations around those areas that we do agree on might be a more efficient use of our time.
I'm just pulling up that document. Do other members of the work group have any feedback on that suggestion? Ms. Woodward.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I echo the summary. It felt very reflective and accurate. And I think if we could start in those spaces, that would be great. And I do think, Andrew, you did a nice job of chunking the recommendations kind of throughout those categories. I think seeing it in the report would be lovely. And I think, even just starting with mandatory staff training, if we could just start there and spend time on, okay, let's see if we can get through that one before we get to maybe some more of the complex ones like funding, that could be helpful. So agreed.
Any other thoughts from members? Is there, Ms. Heiser, do you have any feedback on Ms. Woodward's suggestion?
Thank you, Chair. I'm in agreement. Yeah, let's start on mandatory staff training, staff supports, and culture shift, which I think is an area that, we've got a lot of different recommendations, but they all seem to center on the idea of ongoing mandatory staff training, who should be in the IEP team meetings. And I think, although I'm just doing a quick glance here, I think another common point here is that special ed and gen ed staff need to have the training around de-escalation and co-regulation. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's where we have some consensus.
Not hearing anyone object. Oh, Ms. Hulse?
That was not necessarily included in our recommendation at the time, particularly because I think at this point, we're focused specifically on special education staff for that training. That I think is a point of discussion.
So then let's talk about that. So I know that there were proposals that everyone from the specialists in the classroom to the individuals working in the lunch area to custodians to everybody received some training on how to best support our students with high needs, or any student, I guess maybe I should back up. What, in terms of training, and if we're going to loop in non-education staff, like our lunch personnel, custodians, bus monitors, whatever it may be, what would be the thought there? Ms. Woodward?
Thank you, Chair. May I share a little bit about what this looks like across my system, just to help, I think, maybe give some context and talk about the different types of training that staff receive and how being really thoughtful about which staff are receiving what type of training is important. And I can share a visual out later if that would be useful, just to summarize this. But we have a behavior continuum model in our system. Again, I support 6 school districts, so general ed all the way through special ed, sending 4 programs. And when it comes to our universal approach for everyone, like setting a good foundation for all kids, that training tends to focus on school-wide expectations, positively stated, how do you support kids in upholding those expectations? How do you provide positive preventive reminders and things like that? So it's really looking at, hey, what are the discipline kind of situations we're going to handle in the classroom versus out of the classroom? So the training that they receive is very much about supporting students, preventing behavior challenges to the greatest extent possible, setting everyone up for success with clear expectations. For all staff, kitchen staff, bus drivers, it kind of stays there, like proactive / response. What kind of things, what can you do? How do you respond verbally and appropriately to these behaviors? When we start to then move up to more intensive layers of support, so intervention staff, special education staff, that's where we layer in additional training. So very specific training around verbal de-escalation techniques, for example, because if a classroom teacher isn't able to kind of manage and a student with a disability or a higher behavior need needs that intervention, they're going to call someone else in, a paraprofessional, special ed teacher, student support personnel, to help kind of bring things back and keep them small. So we layer in like very targeted verbal de-escalation at that point. We also do other, kind of train on interventions and things like that based off the needs of the student, instructional strategies, et cetera. We use a very small number of staff and train them on the physical holding restrictive procedures. And we give that training to a small number of staff on purpose, because in order to support those staff, maintain their training, check back in, make sure that they're implementing those strategies with fidelity, the more people, the more drift you see. And so it's keeping that really tight is really important. And then making sure everyone in the building knows what those procedures are so that they're following them appropriately. So I think we need to be cautious about mandating too much training for everyone, because the system starts to just get overburdened with that, and be very thoughtful about, again, to Kate's point, the purpose is seclusion. We're working to prevent it. The people who are typically intervening with a student at the point when they'd be most likely to need that type of support is usually a small, focused number of staff. So I think just encouraging the group to think that way as we mandate, and not over mandate, that gets really tricky on the school side.
Any other thoughts? Ms. Heiser?
I agree. Speaking, I guess I should be speaking for Minnesota Disability Law Center, but also just speaking as an attorney who's represented schools for 13 years. I've done a lot of the trainings and I know staff are overwhelmed with trainings. So I was just looking through our recommendation groups here, and it looks like one of the recommendations was mandatory annual staff training for special ed staff and related service providers on Minnesota Statute 125A.0942, effects of trauma on the brain and brain state-dependent functioning, and effective practices for post-restrictive procedures team debriefing meetings. That being an isolated training makes total sense to me. And having the people who are, the few people who will be in charge of seclusion being trained on seclusion makes total sense. I completely agree. You don't want that to filter out to where anyone thinks that they are trained for seclusion. I think the larger staff suggestions that I'm reading in Melissa's, me, Aaron, and Greta's recommendations, correct me if I'm wrong, is the larger staff training would be around broader issues of de-escalation, bias awareness, team-based crisis responses, prevention, the neurobiology of stress and trauma, effective de-escalation, a much more broad approach for more staff, with the idea of what we talked about with just the mental health piece could just be improved across the board. So I'm in agreement with that proposal, that broader for all staff, isolated training for the few people who should be using seclusion makes complete sense to me.
Ms. Winship?
I agree with what everyone's saying. And I do think, the training of non-licensed staff in something is important. I was just in a district meeting yesterday, and so often I see our front desk staff totally triggering students because they don't have the understanding. When a parent is yelling at them, their only response is to yell back because they don't understand all the nerve, the stuff in our brains that's going on. And so I think that trigger can lead to more and more escalation. And so I think something, I totally agree that yes, we can't mandate that every staff gets intense, deep training on this stuff. But I do think, and maybe it's not within this group, but I do think something for all staff to better understand young people and trauma and how to respond to that without triggering them.
Ms. Stansmark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to agree with Ms. Winship and Ms. Heiser, and thank you, Ms. Woodward, for bringing in making sure, we're not over mandating. Totally understand. But I just want to also affirm, I think when we look at our schools, and I think about what Ms. Woodward said about school climate, perhaps, and thinking about the whole school model too, of making sure that it's just top of mind for everybody. I think a lot of people are in a hard place in our society right now. I think we all know that. So if there's anything that we can do, if it's outside this work group, that's okay. We can establish that. But to maybe incorporate into trainings that already exist to really emphasize the need for mental health supports, or knowing what a crisis actually looks like, what a crisis, what the next steps are. So folks that maybe aren't getting the intensive training can know what a crisis looks like when it's unfolding, and to know when to either step away and ask for the help that they need, I think is also a component of this.
Okay. Ms. Woodward?
Thank you, Chair. Just to throw out an idea, if we're really trying to get to a vote, and maybe consider, and I know we're not here yet, and I know this is a spot where we're far apart on, but bear with me. But let's imagine that we did recommend to allow the limited use of seclusion in emergency situations in settings 3 and 4, and it was limited there. I would recommend, if this is tied to that legislation, that these training requirements, these additional mandated training requirements are contingent in those spaces where that is occurring, like it's all tied together versus, because if, again, that's the focus. So like in order to use seclusion, you must like, and then I think adding school-wide training for like everyone in that building who may be interfacing with a child who then may eventually be experiencing seclusion. Like, I think just being very specific versus all schools statewide, many of whom are not even talking about this because their students with these needs are in the intermediate district or, coming to the cooperative unit. So I guess I'm curious what the group thinks about really focusing that in schools that are, in order to get an approved and permitted seclusion room and be allowed to use it, then you have to provide school-wide training in neurobiology and the impact of trauma and how to prevent, et cetera, et cetera. Starting place to consider.
Ms. Winship.
Yes. I think, on my alternative to seclusion recommendation, it was that we mandate that districts select and implement at least one vetted evidence-based alternative to seclusion. And I think however we determine who that is, for sure, it has to be districts that or buildings that have seclusion rooms. 100% that mandate needs to be part of it, whether it expands to others, but absolutely, yeah. I think if we're getting to a point where we're going to have seclusion, we need that extra training too.
Ms. Woodward, I think your point is well taken, and it reminds me of the discussion that we had last time. I think goals of, a culture shift in schools and staff who nurture and care about students and flexible staff, and all of that is something that we should continue to strive for, and something that is my personal mission. Part of why I went to teacher school and became a licensed teacher, because I don't feel like we have enough teachers in the classroom sometimes that have that ability to be flexible and really reach every student. But I think that's beyond the scope of this work group. I think we can acknowledge it as a need and certainly a goal. And I would be interested in continuing work in that regard. However, we can elevate the cultures of our schools, make sure that everyone from our custodian to the front desk person to whoever might be in the school has some trauma-informed education and training on crisis management and de-escalation. But I think for purposes of recommendations that go into our report, we should kind of hone it in to schools where emergencies occur and restrictive procedures will be used. Specifically, well, we're here to talk about seclusion, but I think if we narrow it down to that, I think we can hone in better on our recommendations. So with that said, I guess I'd want to open it up to any more discussion on the training piece. Right now I think we have some consensus on the mandatory annual staff training for all special education staff from the Woodward, Haveman, and Hulse recommendations. And with regard to settings and schools that use seclusion or restricted procedures in emergency situations, maybe ensuring there is training on the neurobiology of stress and trauma, de-escalation, sort of a lower level, sort of mirroring what occurs in other districts, Ms. Hulse.
Sorry, I'm going to be a stickler about this as a school psychologist. May I propose that we add evidence-based training?
Excellent suggestion. Mr. George and I are taking notes. And I do think training is necessary. I think additional training, I think repeated training, you know, you get that muscle memory, but I also do want to be sensitive to the over training and the constant mandates that come down for additional teacher training that has to happen. I just renewed my license last year. It was an absolute nightmare to go through all the different, I felt like I was checking boxes at some point. But I, with all that in mind and being very, very sensitive to having the state come in and say, you must train on this, I do think this would be useful, at least to keep things front of mind when we're dealing with students who are subject to restrictive holds in some way. Ms. Winship.
Thank you, Senator. I did look into some of the 11 alternatives to seclusion that were listed. And I put together kind of a table that shows like what they are, and all of them include, of course, a training component. So what they are, kind of what the focus is, what the training costs are. And some of them I've heard of and some of them I haven't. So I don't know if you all, one of them was LSCI, Life Space Crisis Intervention. The second one was the Y Toolkit. The third was Ukeru. The fourth was Neurosequential Model, Bruce Perry. And then the last one was TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention. And so just as a starting point of what's out there and what's available and what these trainings would look like, I just started kind of digging into that.
Thanks for doing that. I think I forgot about the 11. So I did not do that homework. Thank you. Let's put a pin in that for when we start talking about alternatives, because I think that's an important discussion to have. When we're in the training and staff support culture shift space, anything else the work group wants to raise as appropriate for a recommendation to be made to the legislature? All right, I was just conferring with Mr. George, like, how do we do this? Are we going to vote? What's the process? I think what would be useful if we're all kind of leaning in the direction of this training, we've identified some language, evidence-based. Yes, we'll include that. I would like us to have language in front of us to actually vote on instead of just voting on a nebulous concept. And so I think coming back at our next meeting, we'll have some language to that effect. Do you want suggestions? Suggestions would be welcomed to kind of flesh out these ideas of what the training would be and who it would be directed toward. Good. Ms. Woodward.
Thank you, Senator. Would you like that in writing between the meeting? Or are you wanting us to discuss that currently?
I think between meetings to hammer out some language that we can, as a group, look at and say, yes, no, change that word, whatever.
Great, great.
Just make sure, yeah, if we have a couple people brainstorming together, just make sure you don't constitute a quorum for purposes of open meeting laws. Thank you. One piece I wanted to talk about in the first recommendation here on the first page, it talks about requirements including in an IEP team. And it reminded me that I worked on that a little bit last session. A copy of that amendment is included with your materials, and I just wanted to make the work group aware of that. I don't think now is the time to discuss it, but there was proposed language that I put together last session augmenting the IEP team when it came to using seclusion. And it addressed some of the things we talked about last time. The IEP, if you see on page 1 of this amendment, AML 007-7, that any agreement to use seclusion would be contained in an IEP plan, and it would be explicitly agreed to by all parents and guardians with legal decision-making authority through written informed consent separate from any other IEP in the parents or guardians' primary language. It had to be explicit consent, not implicit or a failure to respond, showing the parents and guardians the seclusion room or where seclusion occurs, discussing other options for behavior interventions and other supports, discussing the effectiveness of the continued use of seclusion, and directing the Department of Education to develop and maintain an oral translation of any of these notices. So I wanted to put that out there, that this is something that we worked hard on last time, which could be a template for something we come up with in this group, which is why I asked Mr. George to include that in our materials today as well. Ms. Heiser?
Before we leave this topic, I just wanted to call attention to something that was in one of Greta's proposals, but also something that I've heard the school folks bring up a couple times, which is using mentor, I think the word here is mentor response teams, but using the technical assistance. I've heard over and over again, like there are things happening in different districts that we aren't able to reach. We don't have that ability to learn from each other, and that's a non-monetary lift. But it needs some sort of support. So I'm just wondering if that's another piece before we leave staff supports that we could discuss what would be appropriate to utilize the institutional knowledge that people have gained without additional funding needs.
Mr. Haveman?
Thank you for thinking of that, Ms. Heiser. I'm just going to comment really quickly to say that I think that for some of the positions, that's a non-monetary lift. Like myself, when I went to 917, didn't cost me anything to go talk with Kate and her team. However, to release some of the staff members from our buildings, and I think that's a critical piece of this too. Like, we do need the sub coverage, and that is a monetary piece. So I don't think it's as significant as some of the training things that we're talking about, but I think for us to go as comprehensive on that mentor-mentee piece as we're talking about the training components, I think it would be helpful to include that in our funding discussion.
All right, let's put a pin in that and talk about in funding. I don't want to, somebody remember to bring that up if I forget? Okay. Anything else on the training, staff support? And we can circle back too, but I want to make sure that we cover what we want. Okay, let's move into data collection. Data collection, monitoring, accountability. Who wants to start? Ms. Winship.
Thank you. Can I get a rundown of what currently data collection around this looks like? Requirements?
Who can answer that question? Oh, Ms. Woodward?
Yes, thank you. So currently, anytime that seclusion is used, we have to document that, and the vast majority of the state documents that in SPED form. So there's an individualized documentation structure in SPED forms, and we have notification requirements for parents. From there, we have to submit quarterly seclusion reports to the Minnesota Department of Ed. So there's a system we use called Stepwell, where we enter in that data on a quarterly basis. We report physical holds annually, but seclusion we report quarterly. So we have to enter in that data by student. So their student identification number gets entered, their name, their race, their grade, what happened, any injuries to the student, any injuries to the staff, like all of that has to get reported into the system. And then we're able to see at the end of that submission a report about that quarter, and then that goes directly to MDE. Did I miss anything?
Ms. Woodward?
I'm sorry. I just think if, when you look at, from our lens, there are pretty solid reporting requirements in place. I think where some of the spirit behind some of our recommendations is, how is that information getting used, particularly at the student level, which is why you see that recommendation for that explicit requirement to review that data when that is part of a student's plan, to review that data with the IEP team, because we have, progress reporting requirements, we have annual review requirements, we have other requirements for, looking at the student's IEP, considering revisions when, we meet certain thresholds. But I don't know of anything off the top of my head, I say with moderate confidence, that explicitly requires the review. Is that particular data going up, going down? Where are we at? But I could be wrong, and I'm glad to stand corrected.
Ms. Halls?
Not to argue with my fabulous colleague, but I will say we are required to debrief every incident of either physical holding or seclusion. And I think that is the data that really drives those decisions. And so we must keep a record of that debrief, and that follows the student's file. And from those debriefings, we often, bring information to IEP team meetings and often propose changes or have discussions with families about perhaps conducting a new FBA for students, a functional behavioral assessment. We may propose making changes to a student's schedule or perhaps other elements of their programming based on some of what we're seeing or what we're figuring out in those debriefings. It's simply one piece of the data, but it's often a very important piece because it's after the fact, it's after everyone has calmed down and we've been able to basically dissect that incident. Also, we do have the requirement of the 2 and 30 meetings. So anytime there are 2 restrictive procedures within 30 days, and again, that's physical holding or seclusion, we must have an IEP meeting within 10 calendar days of the second incident. And again, we're looking at those specific incidents that occurred, and we're also looking at debriefing data and any other relevant data for that student. Because again, our goal is never to continue to use restrictive procedures, it's always to look at preventing those. And sometimes it's a change in environment that we need to undertake. Sometimes it's other changes in the programming, it's addition of services, it's any number of things that we can change to really try to prevent that from happening. But I think those debriefing pieces are huge. Oh, yes, and my colleague is whispering to me also, the quarterly reviews. So any district that uses restrictive procedures, which is virtually all districts, restrictive procedures being physical holding, if not seclusion, must have a restrictive procedures plan that they update annually and have posted for the public and anyone else to review. And as part of that plan, you must have a restrictive procedures oversight committee. And your committee must meet at least quarterly. And at that quarterly review, you must review your own internal data. You can certainly review it more frequently, as many districts choose to do. But for instance, in my district, that looks like each of our specific setting 4 and setting 3 sites doing their own data. So, a principal sitting down with an assistant principal and perhaps a lead teacher, a board certified behavior analyst, a mental health person, perhaps I said lead teacher already, can't remember, and really diving into every single restrictive procedure they've had for that quarter, and then looking at it every which way, looking for patterns in race data, disability data, time of day of week, area of building, every single thing you can think of. We've got a template, right? And running through all of those data for themselves. And then we look at it at a district level. So all of the leaders from my district come together, and then I have the district-wide template, and we aggregate our district data. And again, we look at time of day of week, racial data, disability data. What are we doing to make our data go down? What are we inadvertently doing that our data might be going up in cases? What training needs are we noticing in our staff? Where have we seen restrictive procedures perhaps used incorrectly? Where have we noticed staff injuries going up or down? Where have we noticed student injuries going up or down? I think I've made my point, but these are the things we look at least quarterly, if not more frequently. So.
And are those data points requirements already, or is that what your district has taken kind of the baseline quarterly reporting and built out?
The vast majority of those are incumbent on us to review, and then we've added some additional pieces of our own. But certainly frequency, certainly duration data, those pieces are required for a restrictive procedures oversight committee.
Is racial data mandated to be included in that?
I honestly can't tell you off the top of my head. It is certainly something MDE gives back to us to look at. I don't believe it is a mandate, but I should look before we can get back to you shortly on that.
Ms. Winship?
Thank you. Does it get reported anywhere that those meetings are happening quarterly? Or is it like it's supposed to happen and in your district it happens really well and maybe in other districts it doesn't? Or do you have to tell someone that, yes, we did and this is what we came up with?
Ms. Hulse?
Sure. We simply have to hold those meetings. And my understanding is if we were to ever need to produce any sort of documentation that it occurred, we certainly have that. It is in keeping with our plan, but we don't broadcast those meetings. They aren't open to the public.
Ms. Woodward?
Thank you, Senator. To answer your question, MDE does publish a model agenda for these restrictive procedure quarterly meetings, and many districts mimic theirs off of that model agenda. And so it does include like site, program, and individual student data, again, like what Kate said, and in that bulleted list of what you're supposed to look at, in addition to time of day of week, duration, individuals involved, injuries used in a non-emergency question mark, was it ever inappropriately used, is right there on the sheet. Disproportionate use based off gender, ethnicity, race, or disability, was a school resource officer involved, and other factors. And so it does lay out those prompts to get districts to be looking at that data. And then it also includes training needs, what are the policies and procedures we can refine to reduce the use, and then anything else that group needs to look at. So just wanted to answer that question.
Ms. Heiser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Melissa. Your recommendation around the standardized data collection system for seclusion incidents and then requiring a systemic review process. I'm just curious if that suggestion was for an external sort of systemic review process, or because you're describing an internal review process, but I take your point of if it's an internal review, it's difficult to hold all districts accountable to doing that and to finding patterns. And even when we had the restrictive procedures work group that met monthly and talked about the data, we didn't necessarily know which districts were using seclusion more often than others. It was just, 42 districts reported using seclusion, but do half of all seclusions in the state come from one district? Like that would be pretty interesting data. So I guess I'm just requesting more detail about what your recommendation was and how you saw that maybe playing out.
Ms. Winship.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I guess initially I saw it more internal than external, but now hearing a little bit about what happens, and I think standardizing it and having it, I think it needs to be more than what it is now, perhaps, because again, I'm not convinced that every district is doing it to the level, that you are and actually making changes. So I think some sort of oversight would be important.
Ms. Woodward.
We laid a lot of information out when we were talking through all of that, so I just want to pull it back just a bit because there's the individual student data documentation that happens internally, again, largely in SPED forms. Over 90% of our school districts use SPED forms, so that's very consistent. There's the mandated quarterly review oversight committee meetings. That's what Kate was talking about. But I do want to come back and anchor in the quarterly state reporting that everyone does have to do. It's very standardized. It has to happen quarterly for restrictive procedures. You do get that disaggregated data around race, age, et cetera. And for seclusion, it's every quarter. For restrictive procedure, physical holding, it's annual. And so I think the thing though in your recommendation, Melissa, that I think is missing, and I think we saw in some of the research that is missing, and part of what our recommendation was coming forward to is, what does then that accountability look like? How do we monitor? What is the threshold that's considered appropriate? So Ms. Heiser, to your point, if there is a district that's representing, an extremely large portion of the seclusions, that type of system that we recommended that mimics that ARC process for the MTAS assessment would theoretically catch that stuff because we report a lot of data. And I really strongly do not think we need to change anything with what we report because it's a lot. And the more and more and more reporting requirements you put on teachers and schools, the more opportunities it is to miss something. And right now it's just additional isn't realistic. I really don't think that. And I do think a lot of information is there. So I wanted to clarify the difference because things could have gotten kind of lost in all that info.
Ms. Winship.
I think my worry and what I want to make sure is happening is with that data information, something's actually happening. When we look at the disproportionate rates of Black students, Native students, homeless students that are suspended, as educators, we talk about it constantly. And I don't know anybody actually doing anything about it within school districts. And so that's where I want to make sure that, yes, the information is there. We're discussing it internally. We're providing it to an outside entity, and I want to make sure something's actually happening with it. And again, I'm not talking you all's district because I know something's happening with it, but I want to make sure every district is doing something.
Ms. Woodward.
Could we walk back through our recommendations? Because I really do think we are getting at the heart of what you're talking about, Melissa. and just being clear, like then, roles and responsibilities around that accountability piece. Because in most circumstances, when it comes to accountability, whether that's academic accountability or otherwise, we report all of that data and then the Department of Ed decides to do something with it or not. And so I think that the 3 bullets that we laid out here is trying to get at the heart of what you're saying in mechanisms that are familiar to us as school administrators, and would take again, from our lens, and we don't know all the inner workings of what that implication would actually be at the State Department because we don't live that job day to day. But to us, based off of what we know, these 3 bullets would not result in a dramatic increase in administrative burden at the building level. It would increase accountability measures and things like potential corrective action plans, naming disproportionality rates, and concerning trends and thresholds. So I do think that that's what we were trying to accomplish.
Any feedback on that? Ms. Sandsmark?
I don't know if it's feedback specifically on your recommendations, Ms. Woodward, but I'm thinking about what Ms. Winship has said and what y'all are talking about with your internal review process, what's mandated by the state, all these things. I think some of what we're trying to get to, and maybe this is from my lens working with families and young people especially, I think there's a lack of information, I think, to the broader public, if that makes sense, and accessibility of that information. So maybe it's not that the data collection needs to change so much, it's just how it's reported out publicly. Maybe it's that districts need to put some of the reporting, of course, following all privacy laws, but reporting amount of seclusions happening within a district showing amount of seclusions happening within a certain building. And maybe looking at and reporting that data out so families and students who are likely mostly going to be going to a district website or a school website so they could see it. Or in a similar note, if MDE is also able to show that data more in a more easily accessible way, I think that's part of the problem right now. Is that maybe we are collecting data, but it's staying in these internal systems that feel hard to grasp for so many community members. And I think hard to grasp for a lot of, educators and folks within the system as well. So if there's a way that we can maybe change how that reporting looks, even if the data is the same mandate of what we're collecting. Does that make sense to folks?
I think, Ms. Sandsmark, if I'm hearing you, the data is already there. Somebody needs to do something with it so that people outside of the district have some understanding of what's going on within that district when it comes to restricted procedures and seclusions. And maybe that's a task for MDE. It seems like all that data is going there. And I don't know what they do with it. Ms. Woodward?
It makes me think of the Minnesota report, the school report card. That's what I just pulled up. And, I can type in any school building, any school district, and I can look at, it says more about my school. And one of the drop downs is, are students safe and engaged? And then some of the data you could look at for any school building in the state, because of that data that's already flowing, is engagement and safety, the number of suspensions, expulsions and exclusions, incidents of violence, referrals to law enforcement. So it is in theory, there could be a data point there. Again, the data is already there, and that would be for the department to consider. But it could be another line, restrictive procedures in that district.
Ms. Heiser?
Just want to speak in absolute agreement to the fact that I already had it pulled up and that was my next point. So 100% in agreement with that. I think there's 2 things that are being brought up. One is accessibility of the data, which the report card would tackle. And then the second piece is the accountability or the external review. So I think it's two separate things where we're all saying we don't necessarily need more data. We need to use the data we have better.
Ms. Sandsmark.
I really appreciate the point about the Minnesota report card. Totally agree that that's an excellent resource. A lot of parents don't know that it exists. I'd say majority don't. At least in the broader population of people. So how do we make sure that people have access to it? Can it be easily accessible on every school website? You know, is there something that on every homepage of every district website, there's just a link, hey, here's our report card, so you have an easily accessible thing to do, or way to access that data. Because I think that's just, even though it's great that it's there, it's just, again, access to know that it's there. Just a thought.
In addition to, and I'm thinking about this, like how else would we do this? I know that there tends to be sort of an overwhelming amount of information when you're a parent with a child in school. Just the volume of papers that come home and emails that get sent and online platform notifications. I think parents and caregivers are drowning in information. So I'm wondering for parents and caregivers who are unaware of the school report card, where to find it, how to find it, what it means. In addition to a link, which I know a lot of schools and districts do you have any thoughts on how to make that more accessible to parents and caregivers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Number one, I'd be curious, maybe we can talk to MDE who's in the room to ask about maybe what that could look like, number one. But in talking to families, I think a lot of families really do feel in the dark when it comes to the education of their children. I know people in this work group have had some parts of that experience. And I'm not sure exactly what's needed, but I know that there's just an overwhelm, like you mentioned. Like there's an overwhelm of who to call, when to call, what number do I need to call? Is it the special education line? Is it my principal? Is it my child's counselor? I think if we could give some really clear directives for families about how to engage with the data in their school, I think providing it on local district websites would be helpful, because I think going into MDE databases and the website is overwhelming for a lot of folks, and I help parse through that website all the time for people. So if things can be accessible on websites, if it could be just something that's talked about openly with teachers directly to families also, maybe in an initial meeting, maybe there's something in your packet in back to school night in multiple languages. I'm not sure what the best mode is. I do know talking directly to people is the best way to share information, but I know capacity, there's not always a one-to-one per parent, per teacher, of course. So I'm not 100% sure what the best recommendation there is, but looks like we have Megan from MDE. But I'd be curious, Ms. Ariola, if there are ways in which MDE could share the data differently, or what recommendations you might have, or maybe what's already happening in MDE that we're unaware of too.
Ms. Ariola.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Sandsmark. For the record, my name is Megan Ariola, the Legislative Policy Manager for the Minnesota Department of Education. I want to just say first for the committee that we are reviewing the recommendations from folks and the draft of the working group document. So while we may not be able to address everything that's kind of been brought up in conversation today, I want to just assure the group that we will have a lot to say, I'm sure, about some of the ideas and some of the just what is currently in existence that may be not allowing this to happen right now, that even if the recommendation is agreed to, needs to be factored into kind of what the working group comes with. So kind of taking us back a little bit in the conversation to some of the questions around reporting and obligations. And I know that there was some discussion on the district restricted procedures meetings and some of those. So the restricted procedures data collection and standards is established in statute, very explicitly does require reporting of race, gender, and disability status as part of that. And those are reported to MDE. For folks playing along at home, it's Minnesota Statute 125A.0942. And MDE publishes an annual report with this state level disaggregated data. So I think it's somebody laid out that there's kind of multiple steps when we're talking about restricted procedures, including physical holds that take place in terms of addressing it with the family, addressing it with the district, and then the state's publication of all the data that comes in after the fact there. So that's having to do with restricted procedures and including physical holds. Last time I was up, I spoke a little bit about some of the just process of how we report seclusion or how we report on instances of seclusion, how MDE responds, and the kind of the process parts that we can't necessarily make assumptions about on the front end without meeting our obligations for a fair and thorough investigation into allegations. So I think we are reviewing the recommendations in terms of some of the data collection stuff, but I do want to let the group know that for things like anonymous reporting or kind of limiting what feels like identifiable data or makes people feel like they can't talk to the district without having some of that security. IDEA does not allow those reports to be anonymous, kind of point blank, period. And that is something where, how and when and to whom information goes, I think is a separate conversation. But I did just want to clear that up as long as I'm here. And I'm so glad to hear that everybody knows and is familiar with our Minnesota report card. But MDE will be back with more comments, but at least some of the questions that were addressed today, I did just want to give some answers where we could check those boxes off. So thank you very much for calling me up.
Appreciate your help. Thank you. Ms. Heiser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Megan, while you're in the seat, you said when the restrictive procedure or the seclusion particularly is used, that disability has to be reported. Correct me, I can't remember from looking at the reports. Does the eligibility category have to be reported, or is it just yes or no to disability?
And it's a very it's a big block of text right now. So I'm looking at it and I'm gonna just be needing a second to scroll. So actually we do report disability status on any use of a restricted procedure, not just a seclusion. So that report, every single report has the student's disability status. I don't believe there's a requirement for if there's a disability that they have to report to the federal setting, but admittedly, I am just looking at the language of statute right now. So we can get back and confirm that.
Ms. Hulse?
Just to be clear, Ms. Heiser, you're asking about which disability category, correct?
Heiser.
Correct.
Yes, when you are reporting seclusion in Stepwell, it does require you to report which primary disability category the student falls under.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any more discussion on the accountability piece? Have we made any headway there? Mr. Haveman.
Yeah, I just want to explore this a little bit more. Thanks, Madam Chair. So as we think about what you're asking for, Ms. Sandsmark, when it comes to sharing this data more, I guess, objectively or transparently, whichever word you want to use, I think about what we're already doing. So we're already reviewing this annually with the family. However, I think to Ms. Woodward's point, I do think that what we're not doing is we're not maybe summarizing. So if we've had a year with a lot of restricted procedures or seclusion, yes, we may have had 2 and 30 meetings. We may have had multiple IEP meetings that year. It may be in everybody's awareness that there's been multiple restricted procedures of different kinds. But did we summarize that? Probably not. So I like the possible addition of that. I hesitate to think it's maybe a good idea to have this information on like the number of restricted procedures or seclusions as part of like the district's website, report card, whatever. I just think back to our own data, like 1 or 2 students makes a huge difference in our buildings. Like we could have one student that just moved in where we all of a sudden our data spikes. There's good reason for it. The parents involved are aware of it. The students aware of it. We're working through those things. I'm not sure what purpose it serves out of context to have that data just be out there, as it like ebbs and flows pretty significantly a lot of times, depending on the students that are moving in, moving out, or whatever. So even when it dips one year, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing anything like significantly better. It could mean that a student moved out, and that's all it might mean. So I'm not sure what that does for us. So I'm just thinking through what that would do to have that just kind of be out there without the context of what's actually happening.
And I think my concern with that too is each incidence of the door being closed is a use of seclusion. So you could have a student not be ready, the door opens, they're not ready, the door closes. You could have 10 instances in 5 minutes. And I think that's something that wouldn't necessarily represent or give the full picture to what actually goes on within that particular school. Ms. Heiser.
I agree, but that's the same with everything that's on the report card. I mean, suspensions, expulsions, incidents of violence, referrals to law enforcement, they're all without context. They're just presented as data. And so the data is accessible to the public. The public can make conclusions. MDE can dig into it and find out if there are issues that need to be addressed. But with all of this data, it's all presented without context. I'm very familiar with the Minnesota report card because I used it intimately when I was moving into Minnesota and needed to pick a school district. And granted, I'm a fairly sophisticated user of school data, but I went through the report card for multiple districts very intimately to try to figure out what the numbers looked like, knowing very well I did not have context, and things could have changed. And there's stories that happen inside school districts that we can't share. But the problem of this data is being taken and it's really, really hard to find. And even as we started this discussion months ago, a lot of our questions were around just what are the numbers? Like we can't find the numbers. We can't find the data. And so to only have that data available to the people inside a school district and to only have the inside people in the school district be able to assess that data is a problem that we do not apply to any of the other data that we take about schools and make public so that people can at least have access to them, if not be able to assess what is going on inside the school. They can at least see the numbers.
All right. Any other discussion on data collection, monitoring, accountability? Again, what I would suggest is that folks submit specific language. No, Andrew just made a face. Stand by. Okay. Okay. It'd be good if we had some ability to work together and have consensus, again, without violating open meeting laws. But what I'm hearing is that, and I think what everyone has agreed on, that, and I think it was Ms. Heiser who said, we don't necessarily need more data, we need to use the data we collect better. And so I think I've heard a suggestion that some of this data get included on the MDE school report card, or some other way to make it publicly accessible so that parents or caregivers that have specific questions on the use of restrictive procedures, including seclusion, can at least have a place to go where that data is. Or does that kind of sound like a direction that we all seem to be heading? Ms. Halls?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to add the proposal for now that if we were to entertain the Minnesota report card piece, that we clearly and explicitly label what settings are contained within that school. I think that would be a very important piece. For discussion for now, that would be a recommendation that I have.
Thoughts? Ms. Heiser? No?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I was saying, 1 second. I think that the Minnesota report card, if I'm correct, I'm looking this up. I think that when you pull up a particular school, it has a section where the school has submitted some sort of explanation of the setting and who they are and general norms of the school. I'm just trying to pull up a random school at this point. But I believe there is a section where anytime you pull up a particular school, it says this is the setting, or we only serve students with, specific disabilities, something to that effect. I think Nicole is on the site too, though. So whoever gets there first.
Ms. Woodward?
Thank you, Senator. There is a message from the school, so I guess that's new learning for me. I was looking at one of my buildings. I was like, I should go submit that. For example, one of Dave's buildings in his district has a message. Carner Blue Education Center is a school that serves students in grades K-8 who have emotional behavioral disorders, autism spectrum disorders, and developmental cognitive disabilities. The environment supports provided by building design create a controlled space for students in which to learn, play, and relax. So it definitely paints the picture that this is a very specialized setting. It doesn't say setting for, program. The general public doesn't know what that means, so that's often unhelpful, But I think that type of a description helps give at least some context to the type of school that is. So,
Ms. Sandsmark?
As I was looking as well, looked up a setting for school that I have toured before, and it does not say setting for explicitly, but has a similar description of that we serve this type of population. So it's fairly clear if you're a family looking, but it might be interesting to have that setting number in there for those that would be helpful for, especially for if there are families that know they're looking for specific district type for their child, that might be helpful. But just wanted to agree, and I'm looking at it too.
All right, we have 30 minutes. Let's move on to alternatives to seclusion. Ms. Winship, we circle back to the 11. We spent a lot of time learning about UCARU. I don't know what LSCI, the Y Toolkit, Neuro Sequential Model, or TBIM is. I would think that, I don't know if that we're in a position to name any specific intervention, but I do think we can frame language recommending each district explore for themselves alternative models that may work, including, but not limited to, whatever models are out there that have some track record and some evidence-based accountability or proof or methods. So where do we want to go with this? Oh boy, Ms. Chose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we think about alternatives, are you thinking that we would say, like, pre-approve a handful of them and say a school district, or would we have everybody kind of starting from scratch and exploring them? Would we give them a list? I don't know what would work best, but it seems like having everybody kind of start over and then wonder if certain ones qualify. would be more onerous.
Ms.
Thank you.
Woodward?
Thank you, Senator. I've used the READ Act analogy often in this group, and I want to be clear, like, I'm not saying mandate exactly what every school should use, because that does present challenges for a variety of reasons. But I don't think that the members of this group have the expertise or capacity to dig in and conduct the type of research you would need to say, these are the vetted and evidence-based, interventions that you should use. I see Ms. Heiser shaking her head. No, no, thank you. I do think that though, when we talk about this, it is helpful to pull that stuff forward through technical assistance and see, hey, here are some vetted and evidence-based, alternatives to restrictive procedures that could be used. I mean, again, we have to report every year, what are you doing to help reduce the use? As part of the READ Act, there were just a table of evidence-based interventions listed. And it's the department is not saying you have to use these interventions, but it is a start to say that these have an evidence base. And so I think we have to be careful on all of the onus of any legislation falling on school districts, because it's hard out there. And, like we talked about Ukira, that was like a grassroots kind of movement and has had good traction, and we're very excited about what we're seeing. But if there are other things, I mean, I haven't heard of several of the things on the list of 11. And so what does that technical assistance look like, either from regional, service cooperatives or MDE or other, partnership with other agencies to help provide schools guidance and considerations and options? We need local flexibility in anything that we're doing, because our local contexts vary wildly. So I just think that part is really important.
I do note Ms. Winship's recommendation that districts should select and implement at least one vetted evidence-based alternative to seclusion focused on proactive behavioral support and early de-escalation. That would seem to me to be broad. The problem I have is the mandate that districts select and implement, because that's a cost involved. And even though I began this meeting saying, let's ask for everything we want, the reality is if we're going to put that burden on school districts without the funding to back it up, that creates more of a problem. I think there should be, I like the direction of do a little looking into this, find something that might work for you, and start the process of, there are these things out there. I don't know what that would look like in terms of legislation or recommendations to the legislature. I do also note that Ms. Chose recommends prevention and early intervention through more school-linked mental health services, multi-tiered levels of support, and school staff, which I would wholeheartedly echo. I'm wondering if that's maybe where we start. Ms. Heiser.
I'm floating an idea. MDE puts out its legislative report every year. And in that report, it always includes a list of strategies and resources for school districts to reduce the use of restrictive procedures, eliminate seclusion, and address disproportionalities in the use of restrictive procedures. However, to your point, Nicole, it's a lot to go through. And I'm almost seeing this as when a parent requests an IEE and we send a letter that says, here's the criteria that you need, but also here are some suggested people that we know fit the criteria. So like we've done the work for you. If you want to select them, you can. There are also other people out there, other IEE evaluators out there who just need to meet this criteria. But like we've also done some of the work for you where we think these are good vetted people. I'm kind of thinking of a similar approach to evidence-based alternatives to seclusion programs where the legislative report might say, and this would be, the onus would be on MDE. I'm looking in the corner of the room, hoping she's not going to throw eyes at me. But the onus being in your legislative report, in your annual report, where you say, here are all of these resources available, also saying, and here are 4 or 5 evidence-based alternative seclusion programs that we have vetted and we do believe are appropriate if you want to just go ahead and plug and play one of these for yourself. So I'm just proposing that for conversation. I have not thought that through at all. And apologies to Megan and MDE for suggesting more work, but I take your point that like this is a great, the legislative report has these resources and has for 10 years, something like that. We know they exist, but it still requires a lot of work on the school to then pick something that works for them and to do that, all of that research and all of that training for themselves.
Ms. Ariola, welcome back.
Thank you. So again, I'm always glad when people read our reports. So thank you, Ms. Heiser. I do want to note that this is a relatively new requirement. While we were reporting out as part of the narrative and the findings from the reports that we gathered, it used to be before the 2020-2021 school year that we would get information on what they used to reduce their numbers either upon request or at the district's discretion. Now it is a required part of 2 questions that they have to answer when districts submit their annual physical holding data. We do ask, what strategies did your district try this year to reduce the number of restrictive procedures, including what ways did you do that to address disproportionalities? And of the ones that you tried, what ones would you recommend? So if folks are looking at the FY25 school district's progress in reducing the use of restrictive procedures in schools, beginning on page 50 is where this area that we're talking about is. So there's some narrative summary there about just what elements of what folks were trying were more successful than others. There's some information on like, these were the ones that were, giving us training and resources. And then there is a full list of like, this is all the ones that were tried this year. So to Ms. Heiser's point, yes, it is hard to look at a big, long list of stuff and say, well, which of these apply to me? And in our ongoing work to make these reports useful, this is something that our team would be happy to discuss about how, we do make this appendix useful for folks moving forward. So thank you for mentioning the report.
Thoughts, comments? Ms. Woodward.
Yeah, we talk about accessibility for families. Accessibility for districts is also really important. And so I'm anything that the department can consider around making that information easier. I just appreciate it. And I just want to emphasize that there is a restrictive procedures page. So there's already structure and additional tables, links to some of those programs that are just right there would be so useful.
Ms. Baker.
I just want to echo that when trying to figure out how to make this information available for districts, one of the things that I rely on is what other districts are using. So even if we had a list of those programs or they were linked on the page, if I knew which districts were using those programs successfully, it does help when I reach out to other colleagues and say, how is this working in your setting? What are some things that you've tried? I know as a district, I can speak to LSCI, the Life-Based Crisis Intervention. We have had great success with that. We've implemented it for over 7 years in our setting 4. is also using that same structure so that if we send a student to setting 4 and then they come back within our district, it's really helped with the process of going between that so that the process back and the transition back has been very smooth. I think it pairs really well with Yukiro is what we have noticed this year too. It has a lot of the same trauma-informed practices. What it gave us that we didn't have from other interventions is that it has an intervention structure for our behavior interventionists to work through with our kids. So there's a structure, we train for that every year. And when a behavior interventionist takes a student out of the classroom, they already have a prepared structured intervention based on whatever situation they're encountering that they know how to work that student through. We document that process so then we know the skills that students are developing, where they're at in developing those skills and in the process. So we have lots of data around all of our students. So we know exactly where they're at in that process too. That helps us when we team around students and talk about what's working well, what's not working well, how do we tweak some of those interventions to make sure that kids are getting the services and the support that they need, and that our staff members are also getting the services and supports that they need, because that's the pairing too. Like we can't just put it all on the student. What are we doing for staff as they're trying to figure out how to work best with the student? So I love when knowing what other districts are working on, because then I can ask to come and observe that in their environment too. And I think that's just helpful for districts to pair and partner together.
Ms. Sandsmark, did you have your hand up? Nope. Okay. All right, so what I'm hearing is there is an interest in the working group to encourage, direct, have districts collaborate on alternative means and methods. It sounds like MDE has done a great job of starting to gather that information. I've heard the helpful suggestion that if one is identified as useful, maybe linking that to the district so that other districts who have questions can call that district directly, but some way to reduce having to reinvent the wheel by every district out there as they try to explore alternative methods to deal with emergency situations. Yes, Ms. Toast.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at the MDE follow-up data was in our handout. And 42 school districts reported the use of seclusion in the last 4 years. And it does look like the number of seclusions is going down. But of those 42, do we have any idea how many of them are using an alternative solution? Is this new for most of these 42, or are they already, like the school district we just heard, already using Yukiro and some are? Do we have a sense of that? Because I keep thinking about more support for schools that, I had mentioned in a recommendation, is there a way that we can come in and whether that's like a crisis intervention team, like a support team that comes in and really guides them and helps them, especially the school districts that have high seclusion rates or are struggling to try stuff. Is there best practices, whether that's a mentorship to go forward? It looks like we have 7 here from MDE. So I'm really curious as we map this out about who really might need extra support, or if they're all kind of level set at a certain particular area. That's it. Thank you.
Ms. Oriola, can you help?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. So again, Megan Adiola, Minnesota Department of Education. This, I think, is a question that kind of has to go in hand with some other data we've sent over. So I believe we shared this document that I'm looking at right now for the November 19th hearing. There is a list of local education agencies from FY20 through 25 that reported or were found to have violations related to seclusion. So the list of the 42, 50, 54 respectively school districts would be represented in this list. It's just, in terms of like which ones are using any of these de-escalation or alternative methods to specifically address their use of seclusion in this year, I don't know that that's a level of disaggregation we would have, but that may just be something as simple as looking to the district in question. So I think the November 19th data set goes in hand with that follow-up data. So thank you very much for the opportunity to explain.
Any other comments, questions? Ms. Heiser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Megan, I'm sorry. I'm just getting my head wrapped around these numbers. So on November 19th, MDE shared a list of 15 school districts that were found with violations related to seclusion in state complaints over those 4 years. And then for this meeting, or really at the end of last meeting, the data demonstrating that 42 school districts last school year, 40 of the 2024-25 school year, used seclusion, but that's just a use of seclusion. That's not a violation of the seclusion laws, correct? Okay, just noting.
That's accurate.
Thank you, noting you're shaking your head. And so then to Greta's question, of those 42 school districts that used seclusion in the last school year, we're not really aware of if any of those were using an alternative to seclusion program as well. It's just we know they used seclusion at some point.
I would say that's an accurate summary, Ms. Heiser. And I think this is part of some of that personally identifiable information that we talked about last time, where in the recommendations in our decision letters, that 400 pages of all of this is what it looks like when there's a finding of misuse of seclusion. Part of the recommendations that we, are looking to them to follow up on is, if we've recommended this to you before, why aren't you doing it? So that is part of the investigation when we look into a student maltreatment allegation is, has there been a similar issue in the district before? How has that been addressed? Or or just the plain fact of this was not part of this particular circumstance. So it may be difficult to tie exactly the when and exactly which program, just because it might have been a result of a decision between one decision and another, and we wouldn't want to, tie a school year to a particular student if that's more identifiable.
Okay. Can I ask one more question, Madam Chair?
Yes, Ms. Heiser.
Megan, how common is it when a school district is found in violation of the seclusion laws for the recommendations to include you must adopt some sort of evidence-based alternative to seclusion program?
Ms. Oriola?
I want to give an answer of my best understanding, but I also would hate to be incorrect about this. So I want to double check. My understanding of this is that the responsibility to fulfill the recommendations MDE puts forward when there is a finding of seclusion tie back to the IDEA protections of a particular student. So I think the must is kind of backed by the federal law of it all. But I have to double check about whether we do any sort of after the fact follow up to make sure. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Woodward?
Thank you, Chair. Chair Seeberger, just speaking from experience, what this typically looks like is when there is a violation, let's say it's around the use of a restrictive procedure, the remedy centers around the nature of the violation. So like we talked about at the last meeting, some of those violations had to do with not communicating or, lack of training or whatever, so typically the remedy very much centers on whatever the issue was. So in my district, when we had an issue of, improper use and untrained personnel, our remedy was to train the personnel. And then I had to submit to MDE documentation with signatures of attendees exactly who attended that training. So I am obligated to follow up with them to say, yes, I have satisfied the, remedies that have been assigned to me based on this case. So I just wanted to illustrate what that has looked like in practice.
Ms. Halls?
I also just want to encourage us to be really careful with language. there is no program that bills itself as an evidence-based program that's an alternative to seclusion. There just isn't. And I think, once again, as you go up in setting, it gets really, really difficult to find anything that is truly going to be evidence-based all the time to avoid seclusion or physical holding. Typically, we're looking for something that can help us reduce restrictive procedures. And again, as the setting gets higher, the efficacy often gets lower in research-based. If we're looking for studies, it just gets to be more minimal. And as somebody that's done a lot of research in that area, it's tough. So just caution.
And I do have an answer to Ms. Heiser's question as well. So the training to which Ms. Woodward just referred, that her staff were required to take and signify that they completed, that training is specific to the obligations that the school has to the student under the law. So that training may not include, may not include, and I don't know if it does right now, this is how you de-escalate the situation. It's more of this is what the student's rights are under the law.
Any other comments, questions from members of the work group? Thank you, Ms. Oriola. All right. In the interest of time, I think when it comes to the funding piece, I envision something along the lines of adequate and sufficient funding to support the recommendations that we've made. I don't know that we have to spend a lot of time. I think the funding will tie to whatever our recommendations are to the legislature rather than specific funding, unless someone feels differently. Ms. Heiser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't remember, someone brought up the issue of performance grants versus outright funding. Can you say more about that? Because that might influence how we word that.
Ms. Woodward.
Yeah, so I was talking about competitive grants versus direct funding distribution. And so in larger metro districts, predominantly, they tend to have more staff. And sometimes they even have grant writers on their staff. And so whereas out in greater Minnesota and where I work in smaller rural districts where your principal is also your curriculum director, is also your transportation director in some cases, the capacity to go for grants like that is vastly limited. And so we tend to stand at a disadvantage to larger school districts to win any one of those grants. So for example, there have been a lot of legislation around non-exclusionary discipline, and there was a non-exclusionary discipline grant to help you implement structures that help reduce the need for exclusionary discipline. We had a great proposal that we put forth, and we weren't granted that grant. They tend to also be favoring it. This is my experience in my area, regional cooperative units, like service cooperatives, because again, they're these larger entities that just have more capacity to apply and administer those grants. So we had discussed briefly last meeting direct funding options like student support personnel aid. Now, I want to be clear. Student support personnel aid was a huge legislative win for us. And I am not here to advocate that we reduce student support personnel aid. I know that there's some letters here that were submitted that are concerned about that. I was simply using that as an example that when we are lacking funding to implement structures that could prevent the use of seclusion and we get direct aid, that's helpful. We like to get direct aid. It helps us use it with its intended purpose. But it's hard to have these needs and have to send money back that is so bound up in one specific use. That's the part that gets hard, is when we have to send it back and we have needs that we could meet with it. I don't have any staff applying for the positions. I can't use the funds in that specific way. And so I understand the need to protect that. I want to protect student support personnel aid, But I also think there's an opportunity to look at that and potential expanded uses. But it's a good example of direct aid. Does that help?
I found that helpful too. And I think that's a good example of if there are other funding sources that could be expanded or other existing areas where maybe they're being underutilized that legislatively we could expand the use for that. I guess I would ask for more feedback and ideas on that. I hear you on the direct funding piece versus competitive grants. I think that's an important distinction as well in any recommendation so that Greater Minnesota districts or maybe other districts that don't have the robust resources as some don't get left out of the process. Any other thoughts on the funding piece? Ms. Heiser.
Madam Chair, this might be a naive question, but is it possible for us to recommend earmarking the funding only for those level 3 and level 4 settings that have registered seclusion rooms or report to use seclusion? I mean, getting the funds where they are needed the most, is that a possible recommendation from the group?
Yeah, we can certainly recommend that. Whether that's something the legislature can do is another question. But I think if we do direct that any funds flow specifically to setting 3, setting 4 districts that use seclusion or other restrictive procedures, that then puts the onus on the legislature to figure out how to make that happen. All right. We are almost at time, and I had a caucus that started 30 minutes ago, so I want to wrap up on time for this committee. What I would ask members to do is, first of all, we have some people agreeing to work with Mr. George on wording for the training and support piece, right? Right. I'll turn this part over to Lori. You've got the notes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, I feel free to provide other feedback. I have preliminary thoughts on this for especially the points where there was some agreement today. Work with me on, and we can schedule a small group meeting with those interested. That is less than 9. To work together on some language on these categories where there is agreement, and I'll work with those on introducing that language. That will be introduced at the first meeting in January. Generally, I think what we want is for motions to have specific language rather than just an idea and then me type up something, put in the report, which not everyone had time to look at. And so that's what we're trying to avoid here. I think if there are points that are still without consensus, that might need to be finalized during a meeting with motions and votes. Madam Chair, members, that's my thoughts on a next step. I'm happy to listen to any feedback.
Sounds good to me. Anybody feel differently? Okay. All right. I appreciate your help and guidance on this, Mr. George. What I would also ask members to do, I think, because there are areas where there's still not consensus, still not agreement. Let's be prepared to discuss those at that time as well. I would also ask the members to take a look at the amendment AML 007-7 and come prepared to speak to whether there's any parts of that we may be able to vote on in terms of a recommendation to the legislature. All right, thanks for a productive meeting, good discussion. There being no further business before the working group, we are adjourned.